Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, joins me now. Good to see you, Paul. So the UK on course then to borrow £30 billion less than forecast. That we've talked a little bit about it, but just explain in a bit more detail why.
Well, the first thing is say it's less than forecast last November, but still tens of billions of pounds more than forecast last March. We're still in a much worse position than we were a year ago. It's just that things look a little bit better than they did in November. Why is that? Well, that's partly, as you say, because energy prices have come down and therefore the energy support package is less expensive. It's also, as it happens, because we seem to be getting more tax revenue in than was expected. That might be because the economy is doing a bit better than expected. It might be because the kind of what limited growth we are getting is a bit more tax rich than we expected before. So the numbers look a bit better this year than we thought just a couple of months ago. Very important to be clear, still really quite bad and much worse than a year ago. But what's really going to matter to the Chancellor is what things look like 2, 3, 4 years down the road. And for that, we're going to have to wait for what the Office of Budget Responsibility tells him about their view of the economy. OK, now you might have already answered a little bit of my next question then, because many people will say, well, look, we've heard tonight on the news that more strikes are happening across the public sector. Why can't public sector workers get the pay rises they want if there is more money sloshing around? Well, of course, that is a choice for the government, and the government can choose to give public sector workers more. And given what's happened to their pay over the last, not just the last year, but the last 12 years, there's clearly a case for that. Public sector pay, nurses and teachers and so on, is 10, 15% below where it was in 2010. And that's not been the case across most of the private sector. So there's clearly a case for doing something there, not least because we need to recruit and retain those teachers, nurses, and so on. But it's quite expensive. I mean, to match what the private sector have got this year, we're looking at several billion, maybe £9 billion of extra spending, another several billion in the next financial year. Now, that's quite expensive and that costs money into the long term. The government's going to be worried about that because it'll have an impact on borrowing in the long run. They might decide that they can borrow some more. They might decide actually that they need to put taxes up a little bit to pay for that. They might decide to cut other aspects of spending, or they might decide that they will impose those big pay cuts on the public sector workers. So, as ever, there is a choice here. It's not right to say things can't be afforded. It's a question of the choices the government makes about what it spends its money on.
And just clear something else up for me. When the government says pay rises across the public sector would increase inflation, is that right in your view?
I don't think that's a significant worry. So we've already got a world in which what's happening in the public sector is well behind the private sector. So if you increase wages in the public sector, that's not going to drive up wage demands in the private sector. I don't think that's a worry. The other worry government might have is if they're putting more money into the economy by putting up wages whilst borrowing more, that might be a problem. Well, in the short run, given that it looks like we'll be borrowing less in the next year or so, that shouldn't be too much of a worry. And in the long run, of course, A, we hope inflation will come down, and B, there are also choices about taking more money out in terms of tax. So I think the issue is much more one about the public finances than it is about an impact of increasing wages, the impact that might have on inflation.
OK, very interesting. Obviously, energy is a big source of concern for people at the moment, and we've touched on this already, but Labour is suggesting extending the energy support that's available for households. I mean, is that feasible for the government, given the current financial situation? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, at the moment, of course, the average bill is held at this amount, which equates to £2,500 a year. The government's saying that will go up to £3,000 a year in April. That doesn't mean everyone's bill will go up to £3,000, but the cap will be increased. Now, what we now know or expect will happen to energy prices is that from the summer, they will come down anyway to something around that £2,500 mark. So the consequence of that is that keeping the cap at £2,500 is really only likely to bite in the next quarter of this year, so April, May, June. And will be not terribly expensive, in the order of £2 billion. Now, that's a one-off cost. That's something the government could easily afford within its within the money that it's got. It doesn't make a huge amount of difference, of course, because this is people's bills fall in the spring. but it will help some households if that's what the government decides to do. It's certainly affordable. It's one of the things I'm sure they're considering.